Time for another fairy tale. The supernatural is obviously a common element in fairy tales, but that doesn't always necessarily mean fairies and magic. Once in a while, the spotlight gets shared with miracles and saints, but that doesn't always make it any less fairy tale-y, especially in this case. This story is called Our Lady's Child. Once upon a time near a great forest there lived a woodcutter and his wife. They had a little daughter also who was 3 years old. They were so poor, however, they could no longer even afford one meal a day, and they weren't sure how they were going to be able to provide for their daughter anymore. One day when the woodcutter went out to work, there appeared before him a tall and beautiful woman who was wearing a crown of stars. This was the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus. It's a little confusing that a religious figure like Mary would show up in a fairy tale, especially since the way that she's described here sounds more or less like an elvish queen out of a Tolkien novel. But here and in other stories that she shows up in, she more or less fulfills the role of fairy godmother. Think of her as the fairy godmother to end all fairy godmothers. Mary said to the woodcutter, "You are poor and needy. Bring your child to me and I will take care of her and look after her and be her mother." The woodcutter obeyed, brought his child, and the Virgin Mary took the child up with her to heaven. Can't even imagine how that conversation must have gone with his wife. In any event, the child fared well in heaven. She ate sugar cakes and drank sweet milk, and her clothes were all made out of gold, and the little angels all played with her. Basically sounds like what a 3-year-old would think heaven would be like. And when she was 14 years old, the Virgin Mary called her to her one day and said, "My dear child, I'm about to go away on a long journey. So take into your keeping the keys of the 13 doors of heaven." Hold on, isn't St. Peter supposed to be the one who holds the keys to heaven? Why would you take a responsibility like that away from a perfectly qualified saint and give it to a 14-year-old? 12 of these you may open, and behold the glory which is therein. But the 13th, to which the last key belongs, is forbidden to you. She's gonna open it, isn't she? The girl promised to be obedient, and when the Virgin Mary had gone, the girl began to explore all of the different doors. Each day she opened a different one until she had made the round of 12. Inside each of them sat one of the apostles, surrounded in a great light. Then the forbidden door alone remained, and she felt a great desire to open it and see what was inside, and said to the angels what any 14-year-old would say in a situation like this. "I won't open it completely, and I won't go inside, but I'll unlock it so we can see just a little bit through the opening." All of the angels said, "Oh no! That would be a sin! The Virgin Mary has forbidden it!" Then the girl was silent, but the desire to open the door did not leave her heart, but gnawed at her and tormented her, and let her have no rest. And once the angels had all gone out, she thought to herself, "Now I'm alone. I could just peep in, nobody's watching, and if I do, nobody will ever know." She took the key in her hand, put it in the lock, and turned it round. The door sprang open, and inside she saw the Trinity sitting in fire and glory. Yep, she saw God. I guess for some reason that isn't allowed in heaven. She stayed there a while and looked at everything in amazement. Then she touched the light with her finger, and her finger immediately turned into pure gold. But wait, the door flew open and there was light pouring out of the door, so why didn't— oh, forget it. Immediately, a great fear fell upon her. Just now? She shut the door violently and ran away. But her terror would not leave her no matter what she did. Her heart raced and raced. The gold also stayed on her finger, and though she rubbed it and washed it as much as she could, it would not go away. It was not long before the Virgin Mary came back from her journey. She called the girl before her and asked to have the keys of heaven back. The girl gave her the bunch of keys, and Mary looked into her eyes and said, "Hast thou not opened the 13th door also?" "She knows." Then Mary laid her hand on the girl's heart and felt how fast it was beating, and she knew that she had disobeyed her order and had opened the door. Then she said to her once again, "Art thou certain that thou hast not done it?" "Yes," said the girl for the second time. Then Mary saw her finger, which had become golden from touching the light of heaven, and she knew without a doubt that she had disobeyed her order, and she said one last time, "Have you not done it?" "No," said the girl for the third time. Then the Virgin Mary said, "You have disobeyed me, and besides that, you have lied. You are no longer worthy to be in heaven." Then the girl fell into a deep sleep, and when she awoke, she was back on Earth in the midst of a great wilderness. She wanted to cry out, but she couldn't make a sound. Her voice had been taken away. She sprang up and wanted to run away, but everywhere that she turned she was surrounded by thick hedges of thorns which she could not break through. In the desert in which she was imprisoned, there was an old hollow tree, and this had to be her home. When night came, she crept inside and slept there. This was a shelter from storm and rain, but understandably, it was a miserable life. And she wept bitterly when she remembered how happy that she had been in heaven and how the angels would all play with her. She lived like this year after year in pain and misery. Until one day, when the trees were once more clothed in fresh green, the king of the country was hunting in the forest following a deer, and as it fled into the thicket which shut in this part of the forest, he got off his horse, tore the bushes apart, and cut himself a path with his sword. When he at last forced his way through, he saw a beautiful maiden sitting under the tree. She was entirely covered in her golden hair from head to foot. He stood still and looked at her full of surprise, and he spoke to her, saying, "Who are you? Why are you sitting here in this wilderness?" But she gave no answer because she could not speak. The king continued, "Will you go with me to my castle?" Then she just nodded her head a little. That's all she could do. The king took her in his arms, carried her to his horse, and rode home with her. And when he reached the royal castle, he dressed her in beautiful royal garments and gave her everything in abundance. Although she could not speak, she was still so beautiful and charming that he began to love her with all his heart, and it wasn't long before he married her. After a year or so had passed, the queen brought a baby son into the world. As soon as he was born, the Virgin Mary appeared to her in the middle of the night and said, "If you will tell the truth and confess that you opened the forbidden door, I will open your mouth and give you back your speech. But if you persevere in your sin, I will take your newborn child away with me." Then the queen was permitted to answer, but she remained hard and said, "No, I did not open the forbidden door." Then the Virgin Mary took the newborn child from her arms and vanished with it. Next morning, when the child was nowhere to be found, it was whispered among the people that the queen was a cannibal and had eaten her own child. She heard all of this and could not speak to defend herself, but the king would not believe it because he loved her so much. When a year had gone by, the queen again gave birth to another son, and in the night, the Virgin Mary again came to her and said, "If you will confess that you opened the forbidden door, I will give you your voice back and your son. But if you continue to sin and deny it, I will take this new child away with me also." Then the queen again said, "No, I did not open the forbidden door." Then Mary took the child out of her arms and went away to heaven with him. Next morning, when this child had also disappeared, the people loudly declared that the queen had devoured it, and the king's counselors demanded that she be brought to justice. King, however, loved her so dearly that he would not believe it, and commanded the counselors under pain of death not to say another word about it. The following year, the queen gave birth to a beautiful baby girl, and for the third time, the Virgin Mary appeared to her in the night and said, "Follow me." She took the queen by the hand and led her up to heaven, where she showed her her two sons, who smiled at her. Then the queen rejoiced, and the Virgin Mary said, "Is your heart not yet softened? If you will own up to opening the forbidden door, I will give you your sons back." But for the third time, the queen answered, "No, I did not open the forbidden door." Then the Virgin Mary let her sink back down to earth, and also took her third child with her. The next morning, when the loss was reported abroad, all the people cried aloud, "The queen is a cannibal! She must be judged!" And the king was no longer able to restrain his counselors. Thereupon a trial was held, and since she couldn't speak to defend herself, she was condemned to be burnt at the stake. The wood was got together, the queen was tied to the stake, and the fire began to burn around her. But then the hard ice of her pride melted, and she was moved to repentance. And she thought, "If I could but confess before my death that I opened the door." Then her voice came back to her, and she cried for all to hear, "Yes, Mary, I did it!" Straight away, rain fell from heaven and extinguished the fire, and a light from heaven poured down onto her. The Virgin Mary descended with her two little sons by her side and the newborn baby girl in her arms. Mary spoke kindly to the queen and said, "Anyone who repents of their sin and acknowledges it is forgiven." And then she gave her her 3 children, untied her tongue, and granted her happiness for the rest of her life. As with most fairy tales, there are many different versions, variations, and notable cousins of this story. There is an Italian fairy tale with many of the same elements in which a shape-shifting lizard becomes the girl's foster parent. The lizard bargains with her father to give her up because she's the youngest of 12 daughters, and in return the lizard provides him and the entire family with wealth. Once the girl grows up, the lizard then arranges to have the girl marry the prince, but the girl doesn't say thank you, and so the lizard transforms her head into the head of a goat. There's also a similar Norwegian version in which a beautiful woman takes the poor peasant's daughter off their hands, but it isn't revealed until the end that it was the Virgin Mary the entire time. Furthermore, in this version, the girl opens only 3 doors, none of which she is allowed to go into, releasing the sun, moon, and stars in the process. And each time that Mary comes to take the girl's children away, she actually smears the girl's mouth with blood in order to make the deception convincing. And that's the story of Our Lady's Child. They all lived happily ever after. The end.